Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Connect Africa. Good morning and good afternoon, depending where you are. Once again, welcome back. Welcome to our Connect Africa, our weekly session. Sorry, we are late by half an hour. We had some technical problems. And also, last on Tuesday we didn't do it, so we moved it for today. Um, for tonight, as you can see, for our topic for tonight is the promises, the broken promises, empty promises made by the West, which are not actualized. And then also we look at as a second topic on the ongoing protests in France. Our topic for today is actually motivated by our last topic on Thursday, where we analyzed the Paris new global financial pact. So some of the things we have mentioned there, but we would like to do an extended one since it's really an attention, or we have to bring some knowledge regarding on that. So our own Kwame Gonza is here to give us all the information. Welcome, Kwame.
Thank you very much, Mahlet. I hope you can hear me very well.
Loud and clear so far. Yeah, it's good.
And greetings to all the people who are watching us. We are really glad to have a family that keeps coming back to us and supporting us. So I just want to send out my regards.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So the West, I mean the US and its allies, of course, Europe, have been making actually for the past half a century, but none of them seems to be, to see them really in on reality on the ground. I remember, I think was it in 2022 that President Ramaphosa were in one conference with Africa and Europe where he expressed by saying, there is somewhat what we say an ambition, statement of ambition, and then there is an actual relationship on the ground which really doesn't meet those promises made by the West. For today, we are going to look at actually the recent promises, donations that are promised by the US and Europe for Africa, and particularly also by looking at promises that have been made during the last the Paris new global financial pact. So looking at the history, what are, Kwame, this is for you. I ask for your analysis of how do you look at, the expectation that Africa put in this, multilateral organizations like IMF and World Bank, given considering its history. Do they keep their promises? Should Africa wait there in early, expecting that money that has been promised in those conferences will reach to the continent?
Thank you, Mahlet. Thank you very much. And once again, I want to welcome everyone who's watching us. It is a very timely topic, and I think it is coming at a time when some of the African heads of state have continued to put a lot of hope and expectations in the global financial institutions. Of course, we have seen how the IMF and World Bank have come back to the continent to try to lend again. And what we have to ask ourselves at this point is what happened to the fast lending that happened? What happened to the first wave of lendings in the 1970s and the 1980s?
Mm-hmm.
These types of lendings which happened under the auspices of the World Bank and the IMF, of course, we can talk of the structural adjustments, which came immediately after a lot of coups and chaos that happened in Africa after the independence generation had been removed from power. So what happened after that period from the 1970s up to almost 2000, when the IMF was on the African continent and doing whatever it wants and actually directing the direction of almost all the economies of the continent. And on closer examination, you can see that we did not achieve much. Actually, if anything, our situation got worse on the
Mm-hmm.
African continent. It got much worse because if you remember, in 1945, the United States emerged out of that Second World War very strong. It was the strongest. It was lending given to Europe. We remember the Marshall Plan, which was given to Europe. So Europe did not have money, and the United States looked at Europe as a major market where it would be able to sell its products, the automobiles, and of course the electronics and stuff like that. So it saw it as important to enhance this market and gave them a loan, which was the Marshall Plan, to rebuild so that they can open up and grow the market. Now, when it came to Africa, such a Marshall Plan was never given, even after almost 300 to 400 years of exploitation of the African continent. Nothing was completely given to Africa, completely nothing. So instead, we see that after the period of the 1960s, when people like Nkrumah and all the other leaders who came and tried to rebuild Africa, to build a new Africa by industrialization, the IMF did a lot of coups, of course, together with the Americans, because they are the same. They are the same people. They are the same institutions. They did a lot of coups, and when they came with the structural adjustments, their purpose was to discourage actually industrialization on the African continent and destroy all the industries on the African continent. And that happened. We saw the wave of privatization, the so-called privatization, whereby they tell us that the private sector is the only way. And it is unfortunate that a lot of our leaders, heads of state, they go ahead and buy into this false narrative that the private sector is the only way. Privatization, private sector. You hear these words being, sung. They are singing these words all the time, even though facts are there to show us that it is not only the private sector, and actually it is not the private sector which leads the development of the country. So the IMF, this is the direction in which they took us, and we deindustrialized. And the loans which they gave, actually, which was so much of aid, the so-called aid, it was used, to prop up in many cases corruption. In many cases, you can see people like Mobutu Sese Seko and all the other dictators who were supported by the United States and of course Europe, so that we can deindustrialize and then they can continue to take our material resources. So on the whole, you see that the loans did not benefit the African continent at all until we had the arrival of a new player on the global stage. No infrastructure was built on the African continent during that period. If there's any infrastructure to talk of, it was almost negligible infrastructure, a few here and there, which was not beneficial, which did not push up economic development, which infrastructure which was built in Africa, it was not enough to spark economic development or rapid, economic development on the African continent until a new player, who is China, arrived on the scene. And China started giving more favorable loans. Actually, these loans, even, Kwame Nkrumah, before he was overthrown, he wrote he wrote about the Chinese loans and the Soviet Union loans. When you talk of neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, which he wrote in 1965. So the loans which the United States gave and Europe, they did not benefit the continent. Now, if these loans did not benefit our continent, how do we put new trust in the same institutions which impoverished us, which helped the industrialization, I mean, the deindustrialization of the African continent in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and they unleashed the structural adjustments, which actually sucked wealth that was built immediately after independence. The wealth that was built in Africa immediately after independence was sucked out and sent to Europe using the structural adjustments. And this is the same institutions that we are trying to put new hope in. You know, you see our heads of state trying to put a new hope into these institutions, even though we see that our past engagement has not been beneficial to us as a people. That is number one. If you look at the promises that have been made, let us go back to the first U.S. Africa summit. I mean, it may not be the first, which was organized by President Obama. The money which was promised during that period, which was around I think it was around $48 billion that was promised to Africa. When you look at 1 year after the United States, the US Africa Summit that was conducted by President Barack Obama, you can see that the difference between the trade that existed before the summit and after the summit, there was no really much difference 2 years after the summit was conducted. So which shows you that there was no difference in trade between Africa and the United States. So that makes you look at it and conclude that the promises were not fulfilled. The trade was not carried out. Even though we speak of AGOA, but if you look at AGOA and how much it has delivered to the African continent, it is not hard to conclude that the United States has benefited from AGOA much more than Africa has benefited. And of course, they want to take advantage of cheap labor, and of course, the raw materials themselves. And the United States wants to keep pushing its products, of course, onto the African continent. And we see in places like East Africa, for example, that when the East African community wanted to ban the use of used clothes, you know, the importation of used clothes into the East African community, the United States came out and protested. Why do they want to do this? Because the East African community wanted to put emphasis on local industry, cotton industry, and manufacturing of clothes within the region. And the United States came out and protested and said, if they do that, they are going to be removed from AGOA. They are going to be sanctioned. If they do that, the various countries are going to be sanctioned. So it shows you it is using the AGOA as a tool for domination. So the so-called trade did not actually increase, but even the one which existed is to the benefit of the United States. If you look at the balance of trade between the two countries, the United States and the African continent, we are still not exporting much. Why? Because our continent is not coordinated on one side. We are not coordinated at all, that we have agreed that these are the products that we are going to export. You know, the coffee producing countries, for example, the African continent, are not coordinated. Like you can say, Ethiopia will come together with Uganda and Kenya and Rwanda, who are producing coffee, and say, this is what we are going to do regarding coffee. And we should be able even to set prices, but we are not achieving that. So you can see that Europe and the United States have continued to benefit from this relationship with Africa, and Africa has not benefited. So these institutions, when they come back in this fashion, like what we are seeing with the Paris, with the Paris, the new global financial pact in Paris, which happened recently. I think it makes it unrealistic for us as leaders or as heads of state of the African continent, and even the African citizens, to put hope in the same institutions which did not deliver in the past when we had this relationship. And actually, which institutions and countries have not delivered in the past, looking at our relationship for the last 600 years, or for the last 500, 400, 600 years, which we have had this relationship ever since Europe came into contact with the African continent. So this is where I see that I think we need to tone down on our expectations as Africans, and then we can from there see the way forward. And on the other side, you can see that these countries also, they have a lot of problems. Of course, we can see that the United States and Europe, they say they promised to give their special drawing rights, including China, of course, to they want to make those special drawing rights from the IMF available to the global South, including including Africa. But what they did not mention is how much is going to be, allocated to each of the countries, and in what is the criteria. The criteria has not been mentioned, but rather what they are doing is that they are using a blanket that we have made it available. You see, there is no mechanism of how this is going to be done, but they have just said we have made it available, $100 billion, and this is just to cause excitement within the African leadership, just like how they did during the Paris, the Paris Climate Agreement, that they said they are making $100 billion available to help the global South, counter the effects of the climate change. And now, since 2015, when the Paris climate change happened, not a single dollar, not $1 has been sent to the global South. So by the same people who are making the promises, and they do not have the money. That is another issue. We are seeing things that are happening, across Europe. Economies are shrinking. Economies are in depression. We have seen Germany, and these are the people who were there at the Paris climate, at the Paris new global finance pact. Germany was there, France was there, but these people, their economies are shrinking, and they're facing a lot of problems. They are facing a lot of competition from China when it comes to manufacturing, especially Germany, which depends on automobiles, the manufacturing of automobiles. And it is so terrified, Germany is so terrified because China is taking over the automobile manufacturing, sector across the globe. So these people, they don't have money. So how do you realistically, as an African heads of state, how do you put hope in these people? How do you put hope in these institutions of the people who are already suffering? So this is where I think that as our leaders, they need to be realistic. Apart from the hopes that are being raised, our leaders need to look at things realistically. The United States itself, economically, is facing a lot of problems. Is trying to attract its industries back to the United States. And these are industries we as Africans also, we should be competing for. We should be competing for high value manufacturing. But we are not doing this. And instead, our heads of state have been sort of, ushered into this sort of perpetual thinking that when hopes, are put into these institutions, when promises are made by these institutions, then promises will be fulfilled. And I think that is a very big mistake by our heads of state to make.
Thank you very much, Kwame, really, for that. You have actually lined it out or outlined the historical aspect of it, why really we should not expect that these promised funds will reach to the continent, and then the exploitative approach of the West towards the continent and those so-called international organizations themselves, and then as well how our own continent, due to the fact that we are not coordinated, we are not united in the aspect of trade, how that is really contributing for that exploitative approach of the organizations. Um, and then, you have also laid out the recent example, very recent promises made in 2022 or just few years before that, funds promised for climate change and others, how it did not reach to the continent. So now, in terms of realities, then what should we how Africa can go forward? We need the money. That's one fact. And we have seen now, okay, these organizations are not going to give us, although the way our leaders are taking it or understand it seems different. You have touched on it last time on Thursday, that it's really uh, I don't know if interesting is a word, how they keep on failing to see that the West do not have money. But yeah, so the fact is we need the money. What is the other option? How to go forward for the continent?
So I think with this question, I could really go on and on and on. But first of all, we as Africans and our heads of state, they really have to be realistic. That is one thing. They have to, our heads of state have to analyze things from a realistic point of view. We have to abandon the idea that there's somebody out there who's coming to save us all the time. That is number one. That is aspect number one. And actually, it is President Magufuli who said that Africa, we have to understand that there's no uncle out there or auntie who's coming to Africa to save us. We have to save ourselves. We have to save ourselves, and we have to do things by ourselves. And those people who are sincere, I mean, President Xi Jinping always talks about sincerity, that the United States, if it is approaching China, it should approach China with sincerity. And this means integrity. So Africa, we have to look for people. We have to strike a relationship with the outside world as Africans. Of course, when we are united as Africans, we have to move together. Look at things from a realistic point of view and strike relationships based on reality. I think he's one businessman in Uganda who always says reason and reality. You see, there's a young businessman in Uganda, who is one of the richest. He always says that if you want to get out of a problem, then you have to apply reason and reality. So look at things from a realistic point of view, and then strike relationships which are mutual. And these relationships should be based on sincerity, not people who are making promises that are not going to be fulfilled. And people who are not sincere in their relationship, that they only want to apply a zero-sum game to the relationship. And we have seen this is the behavior of the West. At all times, in all cases in which we have engaged with the West, this has been their outlook on relationships with anyone. Zero-sum game. We should lose and they win everything. Deindustrialize so that we can come and flood your market with the goods. So it's a zero-sum game. So I think that as our leaders, they need to approach this relationship from a realistic point of view, from a historical point of view, and ask, have we gained in the past from this relationship? Number two, the people we are saying that they should give us money, do they have money? Look at how they are conducting their economies. Look at their economy. Do they have money? And when we understand that these people, they don't have money, then this will help us to make adjustments at home. But adjustments are not being made in Africa at home, because we are not looking at things from a realistic point of view. We still have hopes put where they are not supposed to be. You see, so we have hopes that we are going to be fractured and are going to be destroyed, but you have heads of state still moving that direction. The pledges of the Paris Climate Agreement were not fulfilled. So why would African leaders go back again to think that these people are going to fulfill the pledge all of a sudden now? You saw how they treated you during the COVID period. So why do you go back again to ask the same people and say you think that they are going to do something? So if we approach this relationship from that perspective, from a realistic point of view, I think it will help us to understand that these are not sincere people. They don't have a lot of integrity, like how we would want them to have. They don't want a relationship where we have a win-win situation. They want a zero-sum game whereby they win and we lose. And number three, they don't have money. These people, they don't have money. Look at their economy. Look at the infrastructure in the United States is collapsing. Look at the systems. Look at the bridges in the states are collapsing. Look at the homelessness on the streets in California and Los Angeles. So I think that if we approach things and look at the data, it will help us to, to understand that we have ourselves to rely on. Now, when we understand that we have ourselves to rely on, we ask ourselves, is this possible? And it is. President Magufuli did it. He did it. He relied only on resources which are mobilized from Tanzania. And Tanzania, during the global COVID period, when economies were shrinking, Tanzania entered the middle class. It was actually advancing while other economies were shrinking and having problems. During COVID in 2020, Tanzania entered the middle class status. So the resources were mobilized from within the African continent. So then when we understand that it is possible to mobilize these resources, we start cutting down on, we have a lot of advantage in the African continent. We have them, but they are not being used because our leaders, the minds are sort of twisted and they think that the help is supposed to come from outside. If the help doesn't come from outside, we cannot do it. If it doesn't come from the West, the IMF and what, we cannot do it, which is not true. You see, which is not true, but it is the mind that has been locked in certain way that they still think that this is the only way. We have to go to the IMF. We have to listen to the white man before we can evolve. And I think that this is a very wrong, approach. And this is what is keeping us in problems and where people disrespect us even on the global stage. The Europeans disrespect us, especially. And we see even our people dying in the Middle East because the leaders have refused to come out of the mindset which they are trying to approach the world with. And this is very unfortunate. This I think is very unfortunate for the African continent and the people, the African citizens. So when we understand that we have the ability to do these things by ourselves, then that means we go to the next stage. We have to cut expenditure. We have to look for the money. The UN came up with a report in 2021 that the biggest problem Africa is facing is illicit financial outflow. $100 billion is flowing out of the continent every year. $100 billion. And the Europeans are saying they are going to give us $100 billion. So why don't we plug the outflow that is going out of the continent? $100 billion every year. This is every year. The Europeans are talking about $100 billion every year to give us $100 billion. So why not block? If we block the illicit financial outflow that was published according to the UN, then we don't need even to go to the Europeans to ask, for $100 billion. Because even $100 billion was not meant for only Africa. It was meant for the whole global South, including Asian countries and Latin American countries. But we can get this money by ourselves by just blocking off the illicit financial outflow. But is that being done? It's not being done because the mindset is still thinking that Europeans are supposed to save us. So we leave our money to flow out, and then they bring back that money to us as if it is aid, and it is not aid. So I think there's a mindset problem around them. So this will help us to block the outflow. It will help us to cut the unnecessary expenses across the African continent. There's a lot of unnecessary and over expenditure, duplication of activities, which we are doing across the continent. A lot of things we are doing and we are just duplicating. We are not consolidating resources, and we are using our resources actually, which are scarce, to compete against ourselves. Mm-hmm. A country will produce the same good which is being already produced by the other country, and then we have this competition, unnecessary competition. You see, so I think that these things can be closed off. These things can be looked at, and as Africans, I think we can come out with our own source of financing. We have a GDP of $3.5 trillion, which we have always spoken about here. This is not being used because we are fragmented. Now, when we understand that we can only rely on ourselves, we can come here and sit on the table and say, we are Africans. We have a GDP of 3.5 trillion. India has a GDP which is less than ours. The UK has a GDP which is around 2.9 trillion. So if we have a GDP which is bigger than the UK, why do we need to go to the UK when we have a bigger GDP? I think this would bring a new awakening within the African leadership. But it all starts with the understanding that we can do it by ourselves, and we have the resources to do it. We have the market to do it. And the African Continental Free Trade Area is good, but it cannot work if we don't reach this level of mindset and thinking as Africans. So these, I think, they are the advantages which I think that if we realize what we have, then we can be able to take advantage of all these good things that we have. We don't really need to go out there and wait for the IMF and beg for the IMF and beg anyone. China is there, other civilizations are there which have technology. President Xi in the past has said that China is willing to help Africa technologically. So if we have the capital and we have people who are willing to give us technology to manufacture anything which we want across the African continent, I really don't see what we are looking for in the West. I really don't see it. Beats my understanding that we have heads of state who are still going to countries which are already distressed. What are they looking for? I mean, it beats my understanding.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kwame, for that. It really hope that they will listen and we try to distribute this as much as possible, although we doubt that the advisors will fail or, are any short of knowledge really to analyze this. Well, regardless, we will send our video to our respective leaders or others. So I think for me the highlight was Africa needs to. It's time for Africa to re-engage with itself rather than looking for solution outside.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now we are going to move our second topic for tonight, which is the ongoing protests in France. But before that, I would like to give a shout out here for CNDS and Black who are here. Interesting thing what CNDS said. Switzerland is ranked as the least corrupt country in the world, and yet it is a tax haven where stolen money from Africa and global South in general is laundered. Speaking of that outflow of financial illicit.
I think that the topic of corruption is something which needs another day that we can come here and talk about it. because when you look at how Transparency International ranks and talks about corruption, there's a lot of things which are not included in corruption, and if you included them, actually, you could see that in our countries we don't really have corruption. Majority of the corruption is in the West. So I think what he's saying, is correct.
Yeah, let me just continue with CNS because it seems that his comment relates with this topic before we go to the other one. He continued and he said, nationalizing all the resources will be a good start, then deal with the consequences. Privatization is meant to allow for corporations from the West to come in and control the continent's resources. We do agree. And then he continues. He says, "At Kwame, what you said is all true, but I am always worried about the harsh lashes that would land on any African leader or business people if they prioritize African interests."
Yeah, so on that, the only approach is to work together. You see, look at, let me give you an example of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, when it had problems, what did it do? When you have rebels, and of course the United States wanted so bad to intervene, even Europe, to intervene in Ethiopia and overthrow the government. But what did Ethiopia do? Ethiopia just mobilized the region and moved with the region, and it trusted the African Union. Do you want to say that Ethiopia did not have reservations about the African Union? It had. Even you can see these reservations going into the negotiations in South Africa. That the government in Ethiopia started putting out statements that it's like the African Union is being compromised when negotiations were to go on in South Africa. So they still had reservations, but they put trust. They still trusted the African Union. And the Prime Minister Abiy mobilized the region, as a wall. The region acted as a wall to deter this involvement of the West. Because if he had, and these are huge lessons, I think that the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, I think, is a very good reader of Ethiopia. He's someone who has read the history. Because when you allow the UN, that mistake was made in the 1960s. Nkrumah allowed the UN to come to the Congo, to the Congo, and what did they do? When the UN came to the Congo, they killed the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. So this became a lesson, and I think that the Prime Minister, Abiy, read this history. So it would be a huge mistake to allow the UN to come to Ethiopia, that it should be the one which is leading the negotiation. And that is why he rejected it. Because instead they were going to use that as an opportunity to pour weapons, into Tigray and empower them and give them a whole lot of money, give them communication equipment so that they can continue to wage a war against the government and overthrow it. That is what was going to happen. And we saw this partially when the World Food Program was allowed to send food to Tigray. What did they do? They left trucks there so that the rebels can use them, and they used them. So this was a lesson. This was a lesson, for the Prime Minister, for the government in Ethiopia. So I think that we have to trust ourselves. If we trust ourselves as Africans, of course, it doesn't mean total trust. You still have reservations, you still have doubts, but we have to go in. We have to go in and work together as Africans with all our reservations, because we cannot eliminate, you cannot say we have completely eliminated the doubts which we have. We need to work with this relationship which we are going in as Africans of working together. We need to work, we need to be able to stand. Those doubts will be there, but we have to go in because we do not have an option. And that is the mindset we are supposed to go into this relationship with. Alone, we cannot do it. You see that Ghana failed to do it alone. Zimbabwe, when it tried to do it alone, sanctions, huge sanctions were put on Zimbabwe. Tanzania, when it tried to do it alone, you see what happened to President Magufuli. It is not possible to go it alone. It is not possible to go it alone. So we have to find a mechanism of working together as Africans. So that is all I can say to that sort of question or comment.
Yeah,
Of course, they will not allow.
Saying
They will
this.
not allow us. You see, they do not want it. But this is what should energize us as Africans, that they do not want us to go the side of rapid development, of being developed. This should be able to encourage us as Africans to work together.
Yeah, I hope Sandis is listening, and that I hope this answered his question. Aaron, there I welcome, and he has a question, but I think it will that relates perhaps with our second topic. Let me just read the question. It doesn't mean that you have to answer it now. What is your assessment concerning the ex-colonies of France in West Africa regarding their awareness that they are still under the umbrella of France? Don't you think that are lagging behind? Better we tackle it in the next topic. Or I know that it's related with this topic as well.
I just wanted to give him a little bit. Let me just touch on it a little bit. It's very sophisticated, it's very complicated. That relationship is very complicated. And of course, we know people like Kwame Nkrumah said that there's no colonialism which is better. But when you look at the former British colonies, they have a certain degree of independence compared to the former French colonies. And of course, as we know, France has continued to exploit these places. And it is unfortunate, that some of our leaders, of our heads of state, they don't see this. They don't see, I think there's something which Nkrumah used in the 1960s, and they say that it is unfortunate that some of the African heads of state, they do not see the struggles of their fellow brothers as their own. You see? So this is what we see by some of the heads of state. And I'll point out, specifically, like in the ECOWAS, when you look at ECOWAS, you look at people like President Nana Addo and and people of his group, of his kind, you see that Mali was struggling with throwing off French imperialism. Burkina Faso is struggling with throwing off French imperialism. Guinea is struggling with throwing off this imperialism. But someone who should do an analysis and say what is happening on the ground in Mali is people who are struggling to throw off French imperialism. The first thing people like President Nana Addo comes up with is that there should be democracy. There should not be overthrowing of government. There should be what? You see? So I think there's a discrepancy between the understanding of the predicament in which the African people are right now and then the so-called democracy. Because you don't just say democracy, things should be democratic. Because one of the things which Martin Luther King said is that when there is peace, it doesn't mean that peace is good, but there is positive peace and there is negative peace. There's peace which can be there because you are being intimidated. You see? So that peace, it would be just quiet, keeping quiet, and someone will call it peace. And this is what we see in majority of the former French colonies, that there is completely no self-determination. There's no, any dot of self-determination that is allowed in these countries. That when you try to do it, France will come at you with its military, its military machine and put down the revolts. Until in places like Mali and Burkina Faso, we see that the soldiers, the national army was able to stand on the side of the people. And this was the only fortunate situation that, arose. So there's that discrepancy. And we still have the problem in West Africa. The only way to approach it, we have to work together. We have to have leaders on the African continent who care about the whole continent, not only portions of the continent, not only their territories and sections. And that is why I've been saying, and we have been saying on this channel, that people who are progressive on the African continent, like Prime Minister Abe, we see in Zimbabwe, they need to let go of the outlook of only looking inside and saying we have to solve our first problems inside first before we can look outside of the African continent. You have to take care of the whole continent if you are a true African head of state or African statesman, because what is happening to your brothers on the other side, it could easily come to you, like what we saw when we mentioned the example of Ethiopia. It could have easily come if Ethiopia did not mobilize the brothers in the region and the continent, of course, and trust the African Union. So I think our leaders have to go in that direction, and especially those who are on the progressive side who want to see the continent move in the right direction. I think they have to start moving in that direction rapidly, because without that, we cannot defeat France off the continent. We cannot remove it from the continent. And those, of course, who are standing that way, of people practicing self-determination, throwing off this French colonialism, I think they need to be called out. They need to be called out that they should do analysis on what is happening on the ground, and not just mention democracy as an excuse for colonialism, because now democracy is being used as an excuse for colonialism. And that's what we have seen in places like Ivory Coast. Ouattara increased his terms to 30 terms because he's elected by France, and no one said anything. But when Ouattara was coming to power, the excuse was democracy, that President Gbagbo was, trying to disturb democracy, was trying to destroy democracy in Ivory Coast. This was the excuse. This was the excuse which France used, and it was able to intervene in Ivory Coast. But when Ouattara was increasing his terms and amending the constitution to extend his term limits to a third term, Nana Addo did not say anything about democracy. France did not say anything about democracy. So you see that democracy is being used as an excuse to exploit the African people. And certain leaders on the African continent are supporting this. And these such leaders as these, they need to be called out immediately. So while these leaders are doing this, I think those who are progressive on the continent also need to throw their weight behind these countries which are struggling against this French colonialism.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kwame, for that. Yeah, Aaron also said, but I think you have answered it. Don't you think exposing the 11 agreements signed between those suckered agreements between France and the 14 Western African countries in the 16th? So he's asking, don't you think it's a good idea? Yes, it is a good idea. That's what those two countries did, Mali and Burkina Faso.
Yeah, I think even the leaders, they know them. I think even the African leaders know that arrangement. But you find that some people, they have just, they don't have courage. And on this, I'll point out President Akufo-Addo, Nana Addo of Ghana, because he has been very vocal on this issue of democracy, and he needs to be called out. But this democracy, it needs to be in the context of Africa governing itself. If you are talking about democracy, which is being pumped into the continent from outside and being used as an excuse to exploit the African people, I think that needs to be called out. So they know about these agreements. The agreements which were made by the 14 countries, these people, Nana Addos and the rest of the African leaders, they know about them, but they are not doing something about it. And this is why this is what we are calling that the African heads of state who are really so concerned about the continent, who care about this continent, they have to analyze things from a Pan-African point of view, and even the African Union itself. People have to analyze things from a Pan-African point of view, from an African point of view, and say, what is happening in these places. Is it really a coup that is removing democracy, or is it a coup that is removing a fake democracy that was pumped from outside? A fake democracy that is being, shepherded by France from outside, but that democracy is not producing anything for the Africans, because the purpose of democracy, it should be to produce improve the standards of life, improve the standards of life for the people in all areas. But if the democracy which you are talking about is a democracy that is not producing this kind of life that is desired by the people, then when the people start struggling against it, then we need to support them as African people, and questions need to be put. Why are people struggling? So I think that these are things which, these are questions that need to be asked by the leaders themselves when they are talking about democracy, as it is, or as they hope it should be, and how they are envisioning it.
Yeah, thank you, Kwame. Cindy said it's called democracy when a leader does what the West wants, and called dictatorship when a leader is independent minded. I think saying no more. That's it. Aaron, you have another question. It's very, I mean, very true, very provocative. I'm going to read it later. Please stay tuned. I mean, I really like the angles that you're looking at it, and I agree with what you say. But let's move. So for today, we say that our second topic is the ongoing protest in France, and our first topic was, of course, the empty or broken promises that have been made by the West, and then what should be Africa's next action, considering its historical, accounts of those international organizations or countries failing really to keep their promise. Now, it's France, of course, the protest is going on, but it's not really a random choice, because France has been, there's a connection between the two topics. One of those countries who have failed to keep its promises. If we see, for example, when Macron came to power, was it in 2017, that he was talking about, there was this statement, and I called no French policy for Africa. And many people thought, including ourselves or myself, that's a bit like a turning point for France from its La Franc-Afrique, which they think still that part of Africa, especially the Western Africa, belongs to them, as countries continue to pay tax to France. Now, there's a protest now going on in France, where I think there are two elements that we can raise. We are going to talk about the cause. What is really the real cause of this protest? Is it really that child who was killed, or it's something? There's something behind it. Is it really something new for France? Vocalizing, going on the streets and for asking for their voice to be heard. So yeah, Kwame, the question is, what causes these protests? And I really want you to look at it from the point of view of colonialism, versus immigration, which they say it's immigration. I think it has a history of that colonialism. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so when you look at France, actually, when I looked at the demonstrations, the fact that they took almost 5 days, they have taken almost 5 days. I think they are still going on. People looting and taking things, even though they started out as demonstrators. And actually, there are people demonstrating all across. Excuse me. people are demonstrating across the whole of France. When I look at it, it reminds me of the French Revolution, of course, which happened in the 18th century. The French Revolution is the one actually which led to the defeat of France by the Africans in San Domingo, which became Haiti. But it was immediately after that French Revolution, and it was because of inflation and the cost of living had skyrocketed. Yet the kings at that time, I think it was Louis the 16th or Louis the 14th. I don't remember. He was even hanged. He was put on a guillotine by the people who were angry. The people came out on the streets and they demonstrated because the king, they were just partying and carrying out parties and stuff like that. So it reminded me about that situation. So they overthrew the government. That is the time when they overthrew the monarch in France, and the republic was formed, and that is when of course Napoleon came to power and stuff like that. So those are the events which led to the rise of Napoleon, and also they led to the abolition of slavery. Those events surrounding that period, because the Africans were paying attention to what was going on actually in France, and this is where we have been actually analyzing history, and we see how these things are very similar to what is happening today. A lot of things are somewhat similar to what is happening today. That the weaknesses, the Africans in the 18th century in San Domingo, they saw the weaknesses. They saw the structural weaknesses in the French system, with the French government during that period. That is why they started to revolt and then carry out and then defeat France and beat it, and then it started spiraling into the events which led to the abolition of slavery. So when you go back to France, it reminded me of that period. That here is a situation which was triggered by the killing of a child. Of course, he's a French national, a person who was killed, and when he was killed, people came out on the street to demonstrate. But what the media is not telling you through these demonstrations, of course, the mainstream media is not telling you, and of course, the mainstream media, especially in the Western world, is not mentioning these demonstrations, because they have been encouraging demonstrations in other countries like Hong Kong and all the other countries where they don't like. They even come and say people should be left to demonstrate. It is human rights. But what they are not telling you is that France has been having demonstrations since 2020. After the COVID period, the yellow jackets have been on the street in France. People have been demonstrating in France since 2020. Just recently, people have been demonstrating against President Macron's, reforms, which he called the pension reforms, where he's increasing the age, the pension age, where the people are supposed to go to retirement. He increased it, I think, he wants to increase it from 64 to 68. People are demonstrating. They have been demonstrating all this. So if you can see, there is economic hardship that the French government itself does not see where to get the money from. And this actually takes us back. It takes us back to our question, which we addressed when we were talking about why should African heads of state have hope in these people who are saying that they're going to give Africa this and this and this and this money. But these people, they don't have money. That is why the French president is increasing the retirement age of the people so that they can be pension reformed, because they don't have money to give to the people who are retiring. So when we see the demonstrations on the street that are engulfing all the country, we can only conclude that now the frustrations of the people are being brought out in this kind of manner. And when you see people looting, of course, this is economic hardship. People, they do not have enough money to afford these things. So the only option is for them to go out and loot them. So the economic grievances, all of them which have been building up since 2020, is what we are seeing now being triggered by just this single event. Because what the people need is only one event for them to be triggered. and the frustration, all of it will come out. It is also similar to what happened with the SARS movement in Nigeria. You remember what triggered the people in Nigeria, the youth in Nigeria, and they started pouring out all this frustration about the economy. It was the killing. It was because the police killed one person. It killed one youth, and people poured out on the street. And they started demonstrating all over the streets in Nigeria. So it was just a trigger for the economic grievances which the people have, against the government. So this is how I would look at the situation in France also. And this is actually accelerating what we have been talking about, that there's no money in France and the economy is in trouble. The European economies are in a lot of trouble. And actually people have been demonstrating. The other thing I think which I can add is the demonstration. There's a lot of people who have been demonstrating against France and Europe sending weapons to Ukraine. A lot of people have been demonstrating on the streets in that regard, but they are not being listened to. So they see this as an opportunity, to vent out that frustration and destroy things and burn things and loot things and take things, which they cannot afford, the things which they want to afford but they cannot afford, when their government is concentrating on giving aid to Ukraine, yet for them they are suffering. So you can see that to some extent people want to make the government feel certain pain. They want to cause pain to the government so that it can see that how it is approaching the situation is not how they desire it, and they have been demonstrating about it.
It's an interesting point, Kwame. Thank you for that. France has been lately, making that controversial statements. Uh, Lately we have seen President Macron coming out and speaking unilaterally, going forward, and not to, for the EU not to be carried away with the chaos or crisis created by someone else, and blah blah. But then, in a very recent one, actually, he said something against Africa. I think maybe after he knew already he will not be invited to the BRICS summit. Or, yeah, I want you to look at again, really, how much do you think the colonialism element has contributed? Because France, what the French government is thinking is that, they have that a country which is equal for everyone, which they have the open door policy where they welcome all their colonies. Now, those people are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 10% of the population, but I would be happy to be corrected if that is wrong. Because underneath there is really a colonialism element that really France did not acknowledge, except giving that a cover story as it is an equal country for everyone. So, and how should Africa look at this ongoing protests in France? Of course, you mentioned before, how can we expect, for example, France, the biggest contributor to IMF, and now going through this crisis, will donate money to Africa? But yeah, let's talk about first how this colonialism have contributed to this ongoing protests in France.
Yeah, so the attitude, of course, like you mentioned, of France is that they have always had this entitlement, and this entitlement is not only in Europe. Of course, you can see even Britain, that after the World War II, immediately Britain saw that it was collapsing. The colonies were collapsing all up to the 1970s. The countries were getting independence in Africa and Asia. Immediately Britain created the so-called Commonwealth. And this goes on to show you that Britain still felt that it is entitled, to these countries, is entitled to continue to exploit these countries. And you can see even in the writing, in the book which was published by Prince Harry, the book which published, I've forgotten the title of the name, his book which he published recently, he mentioned that him and William, they used to argue with each other that Africa belongs to the other, Africa belongs to me, you see. So Harry and William used to argue with each other, and William used to say that Africa belongs to him, Africa is his, stuff like that. These are things which they used to argue about. And so this continues to show you that these colonialists, they still feel entitled to the African continent, and of course the global South, as we have seen the United States, took over that position after, the World War II, where the United States mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, came up with the doctrine of Monroe, and said that anyone who tampers with countries in Latin America, that person will get problems from the United States. The United States will not allow anyone, to come to and have an oversized influence in Latin America. And so you see cases whereby in the 1960s, when the Soviet Union took missiles in Cuba, which were supposed to be missiles, nuclear missiles, the United States, ran berserk, that they went almost crazy. They wanted almost to start a nuclear war because the Soviet Union took missiles and put them on the island in Cuba. Mind you, Cuba is a sovereign state and it has the right to do whatever it wants. But what the United States is accusing Russia today, of Russia overreacting about them wanting to put missiles in Ukraine, the United States has ever reacted in the same way when it comes to Cuba. So it feels, the United States, with its Monroe Doctrine, it feels entitled to Latin America, all of it, and South America, that it can do whatever it wants there and no one is supposed to have influence over them. So in the same way, Britain, that is how it behaved, that it feels entitled to the countries which were former colonies. Hence, it created the Commonwealth, where these countries should be. And so they should continue to shepherd them through that vehicle and extract the resources which they want and extract all the benefits which they want. And so we see France also creating its own on the other side, the so-called Franco-Afrique, that group where African countries should be sort of guided by France, and then they should continue to put their reserves in France and stuff like that. They should be continued. They should continue to peg their currency on the franc, the French franc, and that's what we are seeing today. So France feels entitled to a certain extent, that just like how Europeans are, all of them, and just like how the United States is when it comes to Latin America, and of course, and the other countries, you can see the United States, its provocations in the South China Sea, we have looked at these. They feel entitled that they are supposed to go about and colonizing these places and control them. So this is the attitude that you see France bringing, that it is supposed to come and sort of transform the people, the so-called assimilation, French assimilation policy, which is supposed to convert some of the Africans so that they can become French people. They're supposed to have certain characteristics. They should have certain way of walking, certain way of talking. They should speak French in a certain way, and they should qualify to be French people. So just like what the official, the diplomat, I think it was Joseph is called Joseph Borrell, at the European Union, mentioned that France is, Europe is a garden, and then we are a farm. In the global South, we are a farm. Africa is a farm, so that they can come and do whatever they want. So this is the attitude you see that France still has even today, that they think that they can come to Africa, just convert a few people, send them to France. Those who are unwanted, we can treat them how they want. And when we go to Africa, we say we want to attend the BRICS summit, we should be allowed to attend the BRICS summit. we are entitled to it. So when they find that things are going in a different way that you people are not accepting, and then that is where you see the French president coming, like how you saw he came to Cameroon, and he was saying that Africans, he started insulting Africans actually, and he said that Africans are not good people because they are not supporting, Ukraine. You see, that we are not good people. Africans are not good people. He used, I think, a certain derogatory word, against Africans when he came to Cameroon. Africans are not good people in a certain way because they have refused to support Ukraine, on the war that is happening, whereby Russia is conducting a war against Ukraine. Africans have refused. And that happened immediately after the vote at the United Nations, where a majority of the African countries refused, and a lot of them are abstained. They refused to support this. So all this stems from that sense of entitlement. They think that however much bad we treat you, you should be able to accept. You should continue to accept. Whatever we tell you, you should accept. If we treat you bad, however bad we treat you, you should accept that we are your masters and you should do what we want. And so all this reaction, negative reaction, which you see that he in South Africa, he responds to Africa in a certain way, all is because the Africans now have started realizing that we are worth something. We are worth more than this. And so this entitlement, then it keeps coming out in that way.
Thank you, Kwame. Now, for me, that was it as far as the questions for tonight. But there are some interesting questions in the comment section. For example, the immediate one that relates to it is that someone is asking Aaron, could it all be the work of the U.S., meaning in this the Protestant French hidden hands? Could it all be the work of U.S. hidden hands behind the French unrest?
Actually, yeah, it's true. A lot of people have actually spoken about it. I think I saw it on some Indian channel. Yeah, it is possible because the United States has done this before, even to Italy. There's a time in the 1960s, I think in 1960s and 1940s, the United States was sponsoring demonstrations even in Italy. Because the United States, even though it wants to keep colonizing the Africans and the global South and Latin America, of course, and the other countries, it still looks at Europe as, in a certain way, it looks at Europe as a sort of like a satellite. A unified Europe is looked at as a satellite state. And that is why you see that majority of the European countries, they always follow the United States wherever it goes. So it doesn't want any policy that upsets that relationship, whereby the United States will lose control over what happens in Europe. Like, for example, right now is occupying Germany. The United States has troops in Germany. So if there was a relationship which Germany developed, for example, with say Russia or China, and that relationship will upset Germany's relationship with the United States would carry out a coup inside the country. So I think it is not out of the question that the United States would carry out this kind of disturbance in France, looking at the French president's approach and position in which he has been aligning himself. You remember we spoke about this when he came from France. He was criticizing and put out this a speech where he is speaking about strategic autonomy of Europe. He wants to go in that direction. So it shows you, it would continue to show you that what we analyzed here and talked about, that there's a crack within the Western world as a group, there's a crack, there's disagreements. This is what we analyzed in the past and mentioned, that there might be cracks in the alliance of the Western world. And we are seeing it even today that Hungary, countries like Hungary, are not agreeing with the continuing of the sanctions on Russia. They are not continuing to agree with this. They are not agreeing with the addition of so-called, aid to Ukraine. Countries like Hungary are not agreeing. So within the European Union itself, there's cracks, there's divisions. So between themselves as a relationship within the Western world as a group, we have seen Macron's positions that he has also been criticizing the United States and where it is driving Europe, because Europe, Macron feels that Europe is sinking. As we have mentioned, the economies are shrinking. The major economies in Europe are having problems. So I think that it would be, it would be credible to think of it in that way, that they want to send a message to Macron and tell him that you cannot have wavering support for us. Your support is wavering, you see? And of course, you can see that the CIA has been doing this in majority of the countries. You can see, for example, in Libya, you can see in Iran, they try to do the same thing. So you can see the pattern is the same. When you examine it, the pattern is the same. So it is not out of the question that they want to send a message to France and Macron and actually all of Europe to send a message that you cannot have wavering support for us. We are seeing that your support is wavering. You are going here and there. You don't want to be in line. You don't want to stand in line where we want you. So let us send a message to you. So I think it is not out of the question.
Thank you, Kwame. I actually started to enjoy really, the questions that are coming from the comment section. Sende says, I like he always bring us the historical facts when we make a mistake. Also, he correct us. So he says, yes, in the 1916s, USA did coups in Greek, Italy. There you go, black. You have all the lists. Italy and other European countries to remove independent governments and install obedient governments, or what they call them in today's phrasing in the news, the errand boys.
I agree. I agree with him. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's what I was talking about. The government majorly, which we are moving in the direction of socialist systems. There's governments which we are being sort of socialist. When the United States saw, for example, in Italy, that a socialist government was coming to take over, it immediately came and sponsored, and the campaigns. They saw that the socialists were going to win in Italy, so it came in and sponsored the other side and poured a lot of money in Italy until the socialists were defeated. So it's the same thing in Greece. Recently, Greece was going through a lot of trouble, and the socialists, of course, you can talk of people like Yanis Varoufakis, who was the recent, who was a minister of finance in Greece. So they created a group, and they were winning because of the way they had been treated. Actually, the United States bullies them too. It doesn't only bully us as Africans and the global south and the other weak countries. It goes in and bullies them also. So it carried out all these things which C&S is talking about.
I think the last one for today, we are so immersed in this discussion. I even forget sometimes to come and tell you, okay, like this is our account. So for those of you who want to support us, please support us in our PayPal account. I'm going to put the link in a minute. But let me just read out this question. Maybe that will be our last question for tonight to take. So Aaron says, let me just put it here. I believe and understand the destiny of all African countries is very much intertwined, but why many countries in Africa do not want to follow the footsteps of countries like Eritrea and Zimbabwe? I think what he means is when it comes to independence, like really being feel full independent in today's uh, world. But I think I would throw Mali in that list as well because they are acting as full independence.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you have anything to say to that, Kwame?
Yeah, I think that since the 1970s when the coup started in 1960s, I mean, there's one thing which Nkrumah said that when he was in Guinea after he had been overthrown in 1966, Nkrumah said that what he's seeing is that Africa is going to be very chaotic after he had been overthrown himself. Because remember, they had killed at that time people like Olympio of Togo. France was instrumental in killing the president of Togo, Olympio. And of course, Nkrumah was trying to organize them during that period. But some of them were resisting, were trying to think that they can build a small island out of a continent, build a small enclave, a small economic enclave out of the whole African continent. So after Nkrumah was overthrown and they had started killing, they had killed Tafa Balewa of Nigeria, was killed in a coup. A lot of things were going on across the continent. So Nkrumah saw these things actually. He had even warned about them in 1963. He had warned the African heads of state, and some of them were laughing at him, including Tafa Balewa of Nigeria, who, when he went back, he was immediately assassinated. So they were laughing at Nkrumah when Nkrumah was saying that, guys, we should unite. If we do not unite, we are going to come from here and they are going to overthrow a lot of you, and even myself, I may not survive. And when they left Addis Ababa in 1963 and they failed to unify the continent, this is exactly what happened. Olympia was killed and the others, they started killing them, assassinations, and Nkrumah himself was overthrown when he was in China, when he was going to Vietnam. So he went to Guinea. So when he reached Guinea, Nkrumah said that what he is seeing that is going to happen in Africa, because even when he was in exile, entering the 70s, because he would die later in 1972, he said that what he's seeing is that Africa is going to submerge, is going to sink. You see, he said that Africa is going to sink so deep, and then with this chaos, and that sinking which he was seeing was what came after. You remember that we had a lot of, for example, the Biafra War, which happened in Nigeria, which was in this, I think it was in the 70s or 80s. Biafra War killed more than 1 million people. Look at the Rwandan genocide in 1990s, it killed more than 1 million people. Look at what happened between Ethiopia and Eritrea. A huge war happened. And yet Nkrumah had warned about all these things. You see, Congo became chaotic. Things became chaotic in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So things were just chaotic, because Nkrumah was seeing all these things. But he had said that, I'm seeing that Africa is going to sink. And then after that chaos that is going to be in Africa, a new Africa will arise out of this chaos. And this new Africa, he said that it will be unrecognizable from the Africa we wanted to build. You see? So yes, this he said that the new Africa that is going to arise out of this chaos is going to be unrecognizable from the Africa that we wanted to build. And if his speech, for example, in 1957, he was talking about African personality and identity. You see, this is the vision he had, a new government, a new type of governance that is by Africans, governance by Africans, resources that are owned by Africans. So why am I saying that? I'm saying this to show you that the Africa that rose out after the overthrow of the independence generation was a far different Africa. That Africa lacks cohesion, that people are running in different directions. You have leaders who are running in different directions. They still don't understand the value of working together. And this is what we have been discussing about, that they do not understand that if you work together, your economy is bigger than that of India. Your economy is bigger than that of Britain. Your economy it becomes the 50th biggest economy across the globe. So those heads of state, they do not understand that. And that is a result of that Africa that arose out. And it is going to take a lot of work for those progressive nations. And it is unfortunate even that the progressive nations like Eritrea or Zimbabwe or Mali or Ethiopia, which you are mentioning, maybe to some extent also, maybe Uganda to some extent, I don't know, many people can argue about that. And in South Africa, we are seeing that it is trying to move in that direction. Also, amongst themselves, there has not been enough coming together, which we want. And I think that the African civil society and we, the Pan-Africanists, have a role to play around there to show the African heads of state that this is the reality. We have to point to them that there's this reality and we have to face it. Stop going in the direction you have been going, because you cannot continue to do the same thing and expect different results. You are not going to get different results by doing the same thing you guys have been doing, by being dispersed, by not working together, by expecting redemption from the same people who put you in the predicament in where you are, in the position where you are, the same people who have exploited you. Do not expect redemption from these people. Stop putting hope in these institutions which have put you in the position where you are. So I think this is the conversation that needs to be sparked across the continent. And I think that conversation needs to start with the Pan-Africanists and the African civil society. We have to find a way of making these leaders see, these heads of state see that we are supposed to work together as Africans. And of course, we can start with the progressive governments, like you've mentioned, Eritrea and Zimbabwe and Mali and South Africa and Ethiopia. These governments, I think we can start with that, but it needs somebody to sacrifice and try to initiate this.
Thank you, Kwame. It's becoming more exciting, more interesting. Yeah, Aaron do not want our viewer, Aaron do not want us to close this session without us commenting, I would say, because the questions, when we come here, we really do prepare ourselves. We research, we read. That's why we say that this is really the one in kind, like the only platform where you get discussion based on research. It's a kind of academy combined with media advocacy. So Aaron, his question is that I put it here: do you think the influence of France in do you think the influence of France is the same for all its ex-colonies? Examples, the influence it has on Arab ex-colonies like Algeria and its ex-colony of Sub-Sahara, for example, like Togo.
Yeah, so there is thank you, Aaron, for that question. So there's a way you can look at it. When you look at the countries which are former colonies in the sub-Saharan Africa and those which were colonized in the northern part, like Algeria, for example, and maybe Morocco to a certain extent, and Mauritania, these countries, to a certain extent, because they have the influence of the Arabs, in the Middle East, so you can see that they have a certain degree of autonomy because of that particular influence from the Arabs. That the Arabs also have a certain degree of autonomy. If you look at, Iran, for example, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Kuwait. So because of the development that has happened there in the Arab world, so they have a certain degree of respect, which they retain for them. That is number one. And if you look at countries like Algeria, which you brought out, for example, the relationship which France had with Algeria was so strained during the struggle for independence that Algeria immediately put a huge wedge between it and France, that it was impossible for France to pull Algeria and pull it in the Francophone or Franco-Afrique countries. because of how Algeria struggled so much to gain independence from France. You know, they died, a lot of people died in Algeria. They struggled, they fought, they really fought, against France, and they lost a lot of people. So Algeria immediately put a wedge. And actually that you can even speak about it for countries like Guinea, because Guinea immediately it got independence, it put a wedge immediately between itself and France, and it did not join that organization which was created by France, where France wanted to put those countries together. So I think Algeria and Guinea are very good examples. So they retained that autonomy of doing things the way they wanted. So that is unlike for other, that is unlike other African countries, which immediately when they were given independence, actually majority of them, many of them which did not so much struggle for it. And they did not have those nationalistic leaders. They just immediately went into that kind of relationship because they expected something good out of it. They expected that France would reform itself and abandon the colonial mentality. And yet that was not going to happen. And even Nkrumah was warning us about that. And when you go to Togo, for example, you go to Olympio. Olympio did not want to be in that group whereby France would be controlling and Francophrique, that group. Olympio wanted to be in it, like how you see Nkrumah wanted to be in the Commonwealth. Nkrumah, of course, was part of the Commonwealth. Ghana was part of the Commonwealth. But Nkrumah was expecting that these people would reform their behavior, that they would not interfere in the political conducting of the country, of the political affairs of the country. So this is what also Olympio expected, that Olympio wanted to be part of the Francophrique, wanted Togo to be part of Francophrique, but he did not want to be controlled by France. He wanted to just get the benefits that would accrue from association with France. For example, economic benefits and stuff. Of course, that is what majority of them expected. And this did not happen. And we saw, of course, what happened to Olympio, because he was resisting what happened to him. They assassinated him. France assassinated him and they killed him because he did not want to go in that direction. So this is the relationship. I mean, when you want to talk about Algeria and you want to talk about the other countries which France has a grip on, I think you can compare also Guinea. You can talk about Guinea, which was Sekou Touré, when he got independence. So you can compare them and look at them in that direction. Those countries which immediately decided to put a wedge and cut that relationship, that umbilical cord with France, they gained a certain level of autonomy, and that's what we see in Guinea and Algeria. We see in Guinea and Algeria. Unfortunately for Togo, after Olympio was killed, a puppet was put there, and then he put Togo wholesale out there, to the control of France.
Good one. I think, yeah, Aaron, your question has been addressed, perhaps in more than in a way that you expected. Kwame has gone on it and elaborated the way he always knew he will give us. We ask a little, he give us more. Good. So, Siendens, let me just. Okay. So what he's saying is, yeah, it's in related to the previous question. France was once a colonial power in Vietnam, but today it has zero influence there. In Algeria, France cannot even fly its fighter jets there, though France is next to Algeria. But in some countries, I'm sure they are able to do that still in West Africa. And so he continues, in Lebanon, France has some influence in the country's politics. In Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Madagascar, Guinea, France has limited, minimal influence. Really? Yeah, so of course he's also responding. Yeah, that's why I said it's related to the previous question. He's responding to Aaron's question. So their influence varies from country to country. Uh, so yeah, that's, I just wanted to read out the comments from CNS. So I think that's it for us. We are here, like we planned to be here 1 hour, but it's 1 hour and 35 minutes. But we did it with pleasure. We're happy for the questions that you have raised, for you to tune here. And for your contribution, it makes it live, and it makes it worse also what we put out here. So please, as we always say, for you there are two ways to really to help the channel. One is you can support the channel through our PayPal account that I have just shared the link, and the other one is for all of you, please go and as soon as we are through with this streaming, please share this video with others. That way we can reach we can reach out to many people, and it's a knowledge we want to reach everyone. So please help us by sharing the video. We are happy that I see that you are satisfied. Thank you, Mahlet and Kwame. It was another superb live stream. God bless you. Yeah, God bless us all. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, before we close, I have really an exciting announcement, which is we are going to be here. Of course, it's Thursday, myself and Kwame, but we will have also Lambert, who is from, he has a website, very interesting articles. Kwame also contributes there, africainterest.org, and he's known with he's very much popular in Twitter. He's a Pan-Africanist. So please tune in. We are going to bring you the topic or the question that Ethiopia is asking to join BRICS. So we are going to here. We will be here to spill the tea. We have done our research. So the three of us will be here analyzing. What is it that Ethiopia going to bring on the table if it joins BRICS? Is its economy that strong? And also, why now? The timing is very, very interesting for Ethiopia to join BRICS. Now, as we have seen in the morning, the foreign ministry have announced that Ethiopia asked to join BRICS. And then in the afternoon, we have read a news from the US lifting that label they put on Ethiopia on the human rights issue. So it's all connected. So please tune in and hit that notification bell. So we're going to post the timing. It will be for sure tomorrow night, but it might not be exactly at 9 o'clock. So thank you once again, Sinovia, Ciendes, Black, Aaron, Fred,
Greetings,
Gantu.
greetings to her. Yeah, she's been very supportive, and greetings to Aaron, greetings to everyone who supported the channel. And those of us who are watching also, we want to ask you to support the channel so that it can grow, and then we can continue to inform our people across the globe, because this is information that we are not getting out there, and we need to inform ourselves, and also we need to contribute like what we are doing. We are not only here to present analysis, but we are also engaged in the work, and that is why we need your support. When you support the channel to grow, probably maybe we may not come here to ask for contribution, but if you're out there and you want to give contributions, we ask you that you do that, so that you can support the work which we are doing, the work which we are talking about of bringing these governments which are progressive to work together. This is what we are working on as Pan-Africanists on the ground. We are speaking to organizations organs of the African Union. We are speaking to Pan-Africanists. We are speaking to all these people so that we can come together and work together as Pan-Africans so that we can advance the very things that we are talking about here, like someone who asked why is Eritrea and Mali not working together, or why is Eritrea and Zimbabwe not working together? Why other African countries not behaving like how Mali and Eritrea would behave? Is because there is something missing, and when you notice that, that means you yourself should do something about it. And we ourselves, of course, noticed that, and we are trying to do something about it. So if you're out there, come and support the work which we are doing. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much. That's it for us. Yes, I don't know if BRICS membership is scary or great for Ethiopia. So be here tomorrow, Black. And so we will give you, of course, our own analysis and then you judge it for yourself. Have a good evening, everyone. So until tomorrow night, bye bye. And thank you very much, Kwame. Yeah.
Bye to everyone.
Bye bye.